Let's begin with a slow breath and drift back into the dusty pages of ancient time. Not the kind of history you find in glorious tales of kings and conquests. No, this is the history of sweat, of grime, of humanity's long and unimpressive battle against body odor. Today, we shower daily, sometimes twice, scrubbing ourselves with scented gels, brushing teeth with minty pastes, and spraying clouds of deodorant before facing the world. But imagine a life without any of that. No soaps. No mouthwash. No running water. Just you, your skin, your sweat, and a cultural understanding that clean meant something very different. In the ancient world, hygiene wasn't the same daily ritual it is now. It wasn't even clothes. For most people, being clean was either a spiritual necessity, a luxury of the wealthy, or, most often, simply not a priority. It's easy to forget that the very idea of bathing every day would have seemed odd, even excessive, in many ancient societies. In fact, the term hygiene itself comes from the Greek goddess Hygeia, who personified health, cleanliness, and sanitation. But don't let that fool you. The ancient Greeks, like many other civilizations, practiced a version of cleanliness that had little to do with bacteria and everything to do with oils, rituals, and philosophical ideas. The struggle for cleanliness is not just a story of water and soap. It's a story of survival. For most of history, the human body was expected to be dusty, tired, and far from fragrant. And the tools we used to deal with that, when we bothered, were astonishingly primitive. Let's start with this idea: hygiene was a forgotten luxury. That is, forgotten by most people, because it was never fully discovered. While the modern world treats hygiene as both necessity and virtue, the ancient world often considered it inconvenient or even dangerous. This wasn't due to laziness. It was the product of an environment where basic needs came first. If you were a Mesopotamian farmer or a Roman peasant, your priority wasn't to smell nice. It was to survive the year without starving. Water was precious and often dirty. Soap, when it existed, was expensive and usually unpleasant. And the knowledge of bacteria, entirely absent. That's where our modern instincts diverge sharply from those of the past. Today, we associate cleanliness with morality, health, and discipline. We wash after touching doorknobs. We sanitize groceries. But the ancients, they were more concerned with ritual purity than microscopic threats. In ancient Israel, for example, you might bathe not because you were dirty, but because the law required it for spiritual cleanliness. Ritual baths known as mikvahs were about restoring a person to a state of purity after events deemed spiritually contaminating, like childbirth or contact with a corpse. The water might not be clean by our standards, but it met the requirements of the divine. This idea of ritual purity versus physical cleanliness shaped much of ancient behavior. In ancient India, cleansing practices were deeply embedded in Ayurvedic medicine and Hindu beliefs. Daily bathing, using herbs and oils, was considered essential for balance and wellness. But again, it wasn't about removing invisible germs. It was about aligning body and spirit. To modern ears, it sounds superstitious. But remember, we didn't even discover bacteria until the 17th century. For thousands of years, filth wasn't a medical concern. It was a nuisance, or a social signifier. In fact, being dirty was sometimes associated with holiness. Monks in early Christian Europe were known to avoid bathing as a sign of humility and spiritual focus. Some saints were celebrated for never changing their clothes. Martyrs stank for the glory of God. This was partly because many people believed that water could carry disease into the body. Skin was considered porous, and soaking it might allow in harmful vapors. This idea would persist well into the Middle Ages, when plague doctors warned against opening the skin's pores. And while elite Romans built elaborate bathhouses with hot and cold pools, most citizens didn't have the time, or the coin, to spend hours reclining in steamy luxury. Bathing was communal, noisy, and often unsanitary. Imagine bathing in water shared by dozens of people who hadn't scrubbed first. It wasn't uncommon for these facilities to be hubs of gossip, relaxation, and infection. Meanwhile, peasants in the fields of Egypt or the forests of Germania had even fewer options. Water was reserved for crops and animals. A quick rinse in the river, if one was nearby, might be the best they got. Showers were unthinkable. Soap was mostly mythical. It's also worth noting how our sense of smell evolved. Today, we are hypersensitive to odors. Ancient people, surrounded by the same smells daily, had much higher tolerance. What we consider foul might have been unremarkable back then. This doesn't mean they liked it, but they lived with it. We also mustn't forget the influence of social class. Cleanliness was often a marker of status. The wealthy could afford perfumed oils, bath attendants, and linen cloths for wiping sweat. The poor used sand or ash, if anything. The farther down the social ladder you went, the more likely you were to live your life in an unwashed state. But here's the strange twist. Despite all the dirt, all the filth, and all the neglect, humanity persisted. People didn't just survive, they thrived. Civilizations grew, cultures blossomed, and cities rose, even if they smelled a little ripe. So, as we begin this gentle journey through the stinking, steaming, soapless saga of ancient hygiene, remember, the struggle for cleanliness is one of the oldest and least glamorous chapters in the human story. It's not about sparkling surfaces or lemon-scented shampoos. It's about mud, ritual, discomfort, and a deep human need to feel slightly less gross. Ancient Mesopotamians and their clay soap. Let's take a slow walk down into the land between the rivers. Not just any rivers, but the Tigris and the Euphrates. A place now dusty and dry, but once rich with mud, heat, and the weight of the first civilizations. Welcome to ancient Mesopotamia. It was here, in what we now call Iraq, that the human urge to wash ourselves began to show faint, muddy signs of progress. Or at least an early attempt. But before we get excited, we should be clear, Mesopotamian hygiene was a far cry from anything we'd call clean. These were people who bathed not because they were dirty, but because their gods told them to. The cities of Uruk, and Babylon were bustling, smelly, sun-baked centers of life. People here invented writing, built ziggurats, and established the earliest laws. And yes, they also came up with something that resembled soap. Now, don't imagine a cheerful yellow bar, wrapped in paper and stamped with a logo. Mesopotamian soap was functional. It was a gritty, sticky blend of ash and animal fat or vegetable oil. More like dirty paste than anything you'd want to touch. But it had its purpose. This early, soap was first used for washing wool and textiles, not skin. So even when they invented soap, it wasn't for themselves. It was for their laundry. Only later did the idea of applying it to the human body start to bubble up, usually in the context of religious ceremonies or medical treatment. But before soap, there was water. Dirty water. Muddy water. The Euphrates might be been sacred, but it wasn't filtered. Bathing, when it happened, often meant a quick splash in a canal or public basin. No privacy. No towels. No concept of rinse and repeat. Still, the Mesopotamians were advanced in their own curious way. The Code of Hammurabi, one of the world's oldest legal documents, talks about sanitation in a way that shows some concern for public health. Not in the modern sense, but they did understand that certain kinds of filth were bad for society. If your house collapsed and killed a neighbor, for instance, that was your fault. If your waste overflowed into someone else's home, also your fault. But bodily hygiene was still something of a spiritual concern. Temples were the cleanest places in town, not because priests liked tidiness, but because gods did. If you were entering a temple to pray or sacrifice, you needed to wash. Not just hands. Sometimes your whole body. This wasn't about cleanliness for comfort. It was about being acceptable to divine eyes. And this is where things get more symbolic. You might not have bathed after a long day in the fields. But if you saw a bad omen, or felt cursed, or were involved in a ritual, then you'd scrub yourself with ashes and rinse in sacred water. Not to get clean, to get pure. This idea shows up again and again in cuneiform tablets. There's one famous Mesopotamian incantation called Sherpu, literally the burning, that describes a long process of ritual purification to rid the sufferer of unknown sins. The afflicted would wash, burn offerings, and speak prayers to cleanse body and soul. It was deeply spiritual and completely unconcerned with armpit odor. Interestingly, Mesopotamians were also the inventors of plumbing, sort of. Archaeologists have found clay pipes in primitive drains in palace bathrooms. These early toilets were flushed by pouring buckets of water into holes in the ground. A few fortunate people even had seated toilets built of brick. But there's no evidence they used these spaces to wash up. Cleanliness and waste were neighbors, but not yet friends. We also have some records of grooming tools. Combs made of bone or ivory. Tweezers for plucking stray hairs. Razors made of bronze. But again, these were for the elite. Most people would have had dirt under their nails, grime behind their ears, and hair that hadn't seen a rinse in weeks. Even the kings, surrounded by servants and gold, didn't exactly sparkle. There are inscriptions praising rulers for their strength, their justice, their connection to the gods. None praise them for their scent. But we do know that perfume was used. Frankincense and myrrh, both imported at great expense, were prized for their ability to cover bad smells. These were burned in rituals, rubbed onto skin, and used in burial ceremonies. If you couldn't be clean, you could at least be fragrant. Let's not forget the climate. Mesopotamia was hot, dry, and dusty. Sweat was constant. So people wore loose clothing, often made of wool or flax, to protect the body. They changed garments when they could. But bathing, that took effort. And firewood. And time. Most just wiped the sweat away and carried on. There's also evidence that people chewed on twigs to clean their teeth, an early version of the toothbrush. These twigs were rubbed along the gums and between teeth to dislodge food. Not for mini freshness. Just to avoid toothaches. If pain was your dentist, you did what you could. So what does all this tell us? That even 5,000 years ago, people were trying. They didn't know what germs were. They didn't know why some people got sick. But they knew that some practices, washing, burning incense, wearing clean clothes, made them feel better. Made the gods happy. Made the priests approve. But most of all, it shows us that cleanliness wasn't about comfort. It was about meaning. About survival. About ritual. The Mesopotamians didn't clean themselves well by modern standards. But they created a structure where purity had a place. Even if they smelled like a burnt sheep covered in ash. So the next time you stand under a warm shower and watch the soap lather, remember that your ancient ancestors were doing their best, with a handful of ash, a pot of fat, and a long list of instructions from the gods. Close your eyes. Imagine the slow ripple of the Nile. Palm trees leaning in lazy arcs. The distant bleating of goats. A sun that never seems to leave. And somewhere nearby, the quiet sizzle of human sweat under linen. Welcome to ancient Egypt. Now, ancient Egyptians were obsessed with the afterlife. But they were also fairly concerned with the here and now, especially when it came to appearance. In fact, ancient Egypt might just be the birthplace of our idea that looking and smelling nice is a kind of social and spiritual duty. However, that doesn't mean they were clean by our standards. Not by a long shot. Let's begin with the heat. The Egyptian climate is unforgiving. Sun-baked earth, almost no rainfall, and a river that both gave life and carried disease. People sweated constantly. Odor was a fact of life. And so, the Egyptians adapted, through rituals, routines, and a rather liberal application of perfume. Soap, as we know it, wasn't common. Instead, Egyptians washed with a mixture of natron, a naturally occurring salt, and water. Natron was also used to mummify the dead, so you can imagine what it did to the living. It dried the skin. Burned if used too often. but it made the body less oily, and that was considered a kind of purification. For the rich, bathing was an organized event. Servants would pour water over their masters while they stood or sat in stone basins. There were no soap suds, no scented bubbles. Just cool water, sometimes infused with herbs or flowers. The poor bathed in the Nile or simply poured jars of water over their heads. Privacy was a luxury. Hygiene, even more so. Hair was another battlefield in the war against dirt. Egyptians often shaved their heads. Not just to stay cool, but to prevent lice. Children ran around bald except for a single plaited lock. Adults wore wigs, thick, ornate ones, sometimes made of human hair, other times of plant fibers or wool. These wigs were symbols of status and beauty. But they also got sweaty, dusty, and full of bugs. Not exactly sanitary. To combat odors, Egyptians used perfumed cones. Yes, cones. These were waxy blobs placed on top of the head, like a scented hat that slowly melted throughout the day. As it melted, it released fragrance, typically myrrh or frankincense, covering the wearer in a pleasant, oily aroma. You still smelled. But now you smelled like a fancy temple. Body hair was another issue. The Egyptians preferred smooth skin. Both men and women shaved with bronze razors, or pulled hairs with tweezers. Some used early depilatory creams, made from things like lime and starch, that burned more than they removed. But the idea was this: to be clean, was to be hairless, dry, and sweet-smelling. At least for the wealthy. Tooth care was inventive. Egyptians chewed sticks to clean their teeth. They also used powders made of crushed eggshell, pumice, and even ground ox hooves. These mixtures cleaned, in a way, but they also destroyed enamel and irritated gums. Bad breath was treated with breath mints made from frankincense and honey, which helped, briefly. For skin care, Egyptians applied unguents, greasy ointments made of animal fat, beeswax, and herbs. These kept the skin moist and supple in the harsh sun. But they also trapped dirt. So unless you had a servant to scrub you daily, your body became a sticky, fragrant canvas of sweat, dust, and old oil. Religious purity also influenced hygiene. Priests of the temples were required to bathe multiple times a day. They shaved their entire bodies, including eyebrows, to avoid defiling the sacred spaces. For ordinary people, ritual cleansing before prayers or offerings was common. But again, this wasn't about removing dirt. It was about spiritual readiness. So what about toilets? Wealthier homes had toilet seats made of limestone or wood, placed over clay pots. These were cleaned by servants or dumped into pits. The poor, they went outside, sometimes into canals. It was smelly and unsanitary, but it was what they had. Interestingly, we know a lot about Egyptian hygiene thanks to tomb paintings. Scenes of bathing, grooming, and perfume making appear often. They weren't showing off luxury. These were acts of spiritual preparation for death and for the afterlife. Being buried dirty was unthinkable. In fact, embalmers, the ones who prepared the dead, were among the most meticulous cleaners in Egypt. They washed the body, removed organs, filled it with natron, and wrapped it in linen. The dead were cleaner than the living. And smelled better too. So what can we take from all this? Egyptians didn't wash every day. They didn't have soap. Their perfumes masked more than they cleansed. But they had a system, a style, a ritual. Cleanliness, to them, was aesthetic, symbolic, and tied to identity. You could be covered in grease and still considered refined. And so, in the dusty heat of the Nile Valley, ancient Egyptians powdered their feet, painted their eyes with coal, and hoped the melting wax cones would keep the flies away. A clean person wasn't the one who scrubbed. It was the one who appeared and smelled like a god. Imagine a slow sunrise over the Ganges. The soft murmur of temple bells. The distant chanting of priests. The cool mist that rises off the river just before dawn. Welcome to ancient India. A place where water wasn't just a tool, it was divine. and where cleaning oneself was not a matter of hygiene, but of the soul. In the ancient Indian world, cleanliness wasn't about avoiding germs. It was about balance, harmony, purity of thought, speech, and body. The Vedas, the oldest sacred texts of India, speak not of soap or scrubbing, but of ritual bathing, of washing away sin, of immersing in sacred waters to cleanse the soul. And the Ganges River, called Ganga Ma, or Mother Ganga, was at the center of it all. To bathe in her waters was to be reborn. To dip into her current was to remove the stains of past lives. She was liquid salvation. Even if her waters were murky, full of silt and human remains. To the ancients, that didn't matter. Spiritual purity outweighed physical grime. Early settlements like Mohenjo-daro, dating back over 4,000 years, had sophisticated drainage systems. Public baths, covered drains, private wells. Their great bath, a massive, brick-lined pool, was not a spa. It was likely a sacred place. A temple of water. People didn't just clean themselves there. They underwent purification. A symbolic restart. Daily bathing became part of religious practice. In Hinduism, cleanliness is next to godliness, not metaphorically, but literally. Touching something impure, like a corpse, bodily fluids, or certain animals, required washing immediately. People bathed before prayer, before meals, after sex, even after stepping into a stranger's home. But don't imagine a hot shower. There were no faucets, no heated water tanks. Most people bathed using clay or bronze pots, scooping water over themselves from wells or rivers. Sometimes they added herbs, neem leaves, turmeric, or sandalwood, to scent and cleanse. Soap, as we know it, wasn't yet in the picture. Instead, people used natural substitutes. Chickpea flour was mixed with water to make a gentle scrub. Sandalwood paste left the body fragrant. Ash was rubbed on the skin, especially by ascetics, who saw physical discomfort as a spiritual tool. Cow dung, sacred in Hinduism, was also used in rituals. Not for smell, certainly, but for spiritual protection. It was believed to ward off evil, cleanse the space, and reconnect the user with purity. The caste system further complicated hygiene. Brahmins, the priestly caste, had strict rules about cleanliness. A Brahmin couldn't eat unless he'd bathed. He had to avoid contact with lower castes, especially Dalits, labeled untouchables. If contact occurred, a ritual bath followed. These rules weren't about disease. They were about spiritual pollution. For Buddhist monks, bathing was part of monastic discipline. But not too often. Over-cleansing the body was seen as vanity. The middle path, moderation, applied to hygiene too. A monk could bathe to remove dust and sweat but not to indulge. Cleanliness was good. Obsession with appearance was not. Jainism took things even further. Jain monks would sometimes go naked, sweeping the ground before them to avoid killing insects. Bathing was permitted, but without harming any organism. No harsh soaps. No hot water. Only what nature provided, gently, passively. And what about the poor? For them, daily bathing was often impossible. Water had to be drawn from wells, carried in clay pots, heated in the sun. Still, even a splash of cool river water in the morning could count as ritual cleansing. A moment of calm before another long, hot day. Tooth care was a part of cleanliness, too. People chewed twigs from neem or acacia trees, fraying the ends into natural brushes. These twigs had antimicrobial properties. And they were cheap. Ayurveda, India's traditional system of medicine, recommended tongue scraping, oil pulling, and herbal rinses. No minty toothpaste. But breath, they hoped, was still manageable. Hair was treated with oils, coconut, sesame, mustard. These were massaged into the scalp to soften, scent, and strengthen. Lice were a constant threat. Combing was essential. Shaving was practiced by ascetics and monks, while laypeople let their hair grow long. Henna and turmeric were used not just to decorate, but also to soothe and purify the skin. Toilets were simple. In many villages, people relieved themselves outdoors, in fields. In towns, some homes had clay-lined pits or channels that emptied into drains. Water was always used for wiping, never paper. The left hand, considered unclean, handled washing. The right was reserved for eating and greeting. This practice continues across much of India even today. So what did clean mean to the ancient Indian? It wasn't about spotless surfaces or antibacterial wipes. It was about honoring the body as a vessel, a temple, something given by the gods and returned to them one day. To be clean was to be worthy of prayer, to remove the invisible layers of karma and impurity clinging to your skin and soul. But was it effective? Well, not always. Communal rivers spread disease. Open-air defecation caused contamination. Skin infections and parasites were common. But again, that wasn't the point. Ancient Indians weren't aiming for modern hygiene. They were aiming for balance, for peace, for cosmic alignment. So next time you wash your hands, imagine doing so beside a river, the sky turning pink, the chanting of distant monks echoing through the air. Your bath water is cold. There's a leaf floating in it. But to you, it's sacred. And that, for an ancient Indian, was enough. This is not your modern spa. This is how cleanliness looked when naked strangers and greasy oils met for a very serious routine, cleansing the body, debating philosophy, and maybe catching a cold. To the ancient Greeks, the human body was something to be admired, not hidden. Physical perfection was divine. Gods were sculpted like athletes. Athletes were worshipped like gods. And how did these people stay clean? By stripping down, rubbing oil all over their bodies, scraping it off with a curved metal tool called a strigil, and then maybe jumping in a cold bath. Let's break it down. Bathing in ancient Greece wasn't primarily about removing dirt. It was more about wellness, balance. The Greeks believed that oil protected the skin, preserved youth, and made the body beautiful. Olive oil was applied liberally, glug, 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 onto bare skin. Then, with a strigil, they'd scrape it off. Along with that would come the dust, sweat, and whatever else had gathered during the day. It was satisfying, squeaky, greasy, and sort of effective. They didn't use soap. Soap was considered crude, barbaric, even. Real men, real Greeks, used oil. Athletes, before competitions, would cover themselves in it. It made the muscles shine, made grappling harder, and made cleanup interesting. Afterward, they scraped themselves clean and sometimes just tossed the oily goop, called gloios, into containers. Some people actually collected this gunk and used it for healing ointments. Or sold it. Yes. Recycled athlete sludge. A booming industry. Greek bathhouses were smaller, simpler than the Roman ones that would follow. You'd have a room for undressing, a warm room, a hot room, a cold plunge. There was steam, massage, sometimes even snacks. It was social. It was normal. To skip a bath was to invite suspicion, and maybe a few wrinkled noses. Then came the Romans. If the Greeks liked bathing, the Romans loved it. They turned it into an art, a ritual, a city-wide routine. Roman bathhouses, called thermae, were monumental. Huge public buildings with rooms for hot, warm, and cold baths. Libraries, gardens, gyms, even restaurants. It was where you went to see and be seen. But what did the Romans do in there? First, they'd change into sandals and maybe a loose tunic. Then, into the apodyterium, the changing room. From there, into the tepidarium, the warm room, to acclimate. Then the cauldrium, the hot, steamy room, where they'd sweat profusely. After that, the frigidarium, with its cold pool, to close the pores and shock the body. All of this while surrounded by marble, mosaics, and the smell of oil and bodies. They also oiled up and scraped it off, just like the Greeks. But Romans took it further. They had slaves to help. They had professional strigil wielders. They had perfumes and scented oils. Rich Romans might bring their own servants to bathe them. Poorer folks bathed together, in crowded rooms, elbow to elbow. Men and women usually bathed separately, but not always. Some emperors allowed mixed bathing. Others banned it. It depended on the politics of modesty. Soap, again, was not in common use. Romans did know how to make it, sort of. They discovered that mixing animal fat with wood ash made a cleaning agent. But they mostly used it for laundry. Not for themselves. They didn't want to scrub. They wanted to oil, scrape, and soak. Tooth care. Romans cleaned their teeth using crushed bones and oyster shells. Sometimes charcoal. Their toothpaste might include ashes, honey, or even powdered deer antler. For mouthwash, some swished with urine. Yes, urine. It contains ammonia, a natural cleaning agent. It worked. But it smelled historic. Hair. Oiled, perfumed, and sometimes dyed. Lice were a problem, especially for soldiers and lower-class citizens. Head shaving was common in the army. Women might pin their hair in elaborate styles, using beeswax, oils, and pins. Sometimes wigs. Hygiene and fashion were one and the same. As for toilets, Romans had them, and they were public. Rows of seats with holes, side by side, no dividers. A long stone bench. Flowing water below. A sponge on a stick, called a tersorium, was used instead of toilet paper. After wiping, the sponge was dipped in vinegar or salt water, then returned to a communal bucket, shared by everyone. No, you didn't bring your own. The idea of sanitary hadn't been invented yet. Public latrines were gathering places. You'd chat, do business, gossip, just as in the baths. Romans saw hygiene as part of social life. Something to be done with others, not in privacy. Even emperors bathed publicly, though their baths were likely nicer, with better oil, and fewer people coughing. Were the baths clean? Not really. Water was reused. Dozens, maybe hundreds, of bodies would soak in the same pools. Skin flakes, hair, oil, sweat, and whatever came in with them. There were no filters, no chlorine. Illnesses could spread easily. And did. But again, like other ancient peoples, Romans weren't trying to kill germs. They didn't know about them. They just wanted to feel clean. Smell nice. Be part of society. By the end of the Roman Empire, some bathhouses had become decadent, lavish. Others were neglected, with crumbling walls, cold water, and fewer visitors. As Christianity rose, bathing fell out of favor. Nudity became sinful. Public baths closed. And Europe would enter centuries of grimy winters. But for a time, in the height of Rome, being clean meant being social, being oily, being one with the crowd. It was strange, greasy, and, by our modern standards, not particularly hygienic. But to them, it was civilization. To refuse a bath was to step outside Roman life. So tonight, if you feel like scrubbing up, maybe skip the soap. Warm some olive oil. Find a friend with a strigil. And remember, once upon a time, being covered in oil meant you were at your cleanest. Let's drift now toward the desert. Toward dry wind, sun-bleached stone, and the low hum of ancient chants echoing off tiled walls. The Middle East, cradle of civilization, and home to some of the earliest ideas about cleanliness not just as a personal habit, but as a sacred duty. Here, cleanliness was never just about appearance. It was spiritual, ritualistic, a way to prepare the body for prayer, to show respect to the divine, and to balance the heat and dust of the environment. To be clean was to be right with the world. And to be dirty was not merely unpleasant, it was impure. But how did people actually clean themselves? Especially in places where water could be rare, precious, or even dangerous to use in excess. Let's start with Mesopotamia. The lands between the Tigris and Euphrates. The earliest cities, bustling and hot, had drainage systems and even rudimentary latrines. In large households, clay pipes carried waste away. Elite citizens may have had wash basins, and a servant to help pour water for hand washing or foot washing. But bathing, overall, wasn't yet systematic. Instead, it was tied to purification. Before entering temples, priests would wash. Before rituals, participants would cleanse themselves. Dirt was seen not only as physical grime but as spiritual disorder. A stain on the soul. Sacred texts and spells instructed people to wash their hands and mouths to banish evil. Scented oils and incense followed. Cleanliness was both sensory and symbolic. Egypt, of course, had its own take. The Nile, flowing like a ribbon of life through a harsh land, provided the water. Egyptians bathed frequently, if they could. The wealthy had stone basins and water jars, with servants to assist. Everyone else washed with what they could carry. Soap existed, sort of. A mix of animal fat and alkaline salts, used for laundry and sometimes skin. But oil was still favored. And scent was everything. The heat was relentless. Bodies sweat constantly. To mask the smell, people rubbed themselves with perfumes made from myrrh, cinnamon, lotus, and more. Hair was shaved. Wigs were worn. Lice were avoided. Oils were massaged into the scalp, and even the poorest wore beads of scented wax on their heads that melted slowly in the sun, releasing perfume. Ingenious. And a little bit melty. But we must not skip over the true revolution of ancient cleanliness, ritual washing and religious life. Judaism, emerging in the Levant, placed great emphasis on ritual purity. The mikveh, a ritual bath, was essential for returning to a state of cleanliness after certain events, like menstruation, ejaculation, touching a corpse, or childbirth. The rules were detailed. Specific. Not about dirt, but about readiness for spiritual connection. Water had to be living, that is, naturally gathered from rain or a spring. The body had to be fully submerged. Clothes removed. Every inch of skin exposed. It wasn't a bath for soap and scrub brushes. It was a bath for the soul. Islam, centuries later, would echo many of these ideas. Cleanliness is half of faith, said the Prophet Muhammad. And from this came a whole body of law, tahara, detailing how, when, and why to clean the body. Before each of the 5 daily prayers, Muslims perform wudu, a ritual washing of the hands, mouth, nose, face, arms, head, ears, and feet. It's methodical, quiet, intentional. And like in Judaism, this cleansing isn't just about hygiene. It's about readiness, about humility before God. If one is in a state requiring a full body wash, like after sex or menstruation, then ghusl, a complete washing, is done. If water isn't available, a symbolic cleansing with clean sand or dust, tayammum, can be performed instead. Even in scarcity, there is a way to purify. Muslim cities in the medieval period took cleanliness seriously. Public bathhouses, hammams, became central to urban life. Men and women bathed on different days or in separate sections. The experience was structured, calming and, most of all, hot. One began in a warm room to adjust. Then entered the hottest space, full of steam. There, attendants would scrub the skin, removing dead cells with a rough glove. The bather might be massaged, splashed with warm water, and left to relax on a heated stone slab. Afterward, a plunge into cool water would invigorate the skin. It was a balance of hot and cold, soft and rough. A slow return to a feeling of renewal. Hammams were places of rest, gossip, and health. Doctors prescribed hammam visits for illnesses. Pregnant women relaxed there. Children played in their own sections. And scented smoke, burned herbs, oils, and incense perfumed the air. Even without a modern understanding of bacteria, the hammam created a sense of well-being, a place to feel restored. Hair removal was also part of ancient Middle Eastern cleanliness. For both men and women, removing underarm and pubic hair was encouraged. Razors, tweezers, sugaring paste made from sugar, lemon, and water, it all helped smooth the skin. Why? To reduce odor, to feel fresh, to follow religious teaching. In a desert environment, it was also just practical. And in case you're wondering, yes, they had deodorants. Not sticks or sprays, but pastes made from crushed herbs, perfumed oils, or alum stones. Sometimes camphor or rosy water was used. The idea of not smelling was ancient. People cared deeply, even when washing options were few. Toilets. In wealthier cities, stone latrines were used. Some homes had ceramic toilet seats. Public toilets existed too. And Muslims emphasized the importance of cleanliness afterward, typically using water to wash, not just wiping. A small water vessel, called a loda or ibrik, was kept near the toilet for this purpose. This water-based cleansing was, and still is, practiced widely in the Middle East and South Asia. It's more thorough than dry wiping and was considered essential to cleanliness. Long before toilet paper was a thing, people figured out what worked, even if it wasn't advertised. So, what did ancient Middle Eastern people teach us about being clean? That sometimes, being clean is less about removing dirt, and more about preparing the soul. That scent, ritual, and stillness matter. That even in the driest lands, people found ways to wash. Even if it meant scrubbing with sand, or bathing in smoke. If you lie in bed tonight, far from the nearest hammam, you can still imagine the warm tile beneath your feet. The sound of water echoing softly. The scent of rose and smoke. You are wrapped in an ancient comfort. One that's more about peace than polish. And in that, perhaps, you are truly clean. As we slowly drift away from the incense-thick warmth of the hammam, we arrive somewhere much colder. Colder in climate. Colder in architecture. And colder in philosophy. We now find ourselves inside the echoing stone walls of a medieval monastery. Here, the air is quiet and heavy. There is no scent of perfume, no gentle chatter, no soft towels. Just the steady rhythm of prayer, candlelight flickering against bare stone, and the silence of personal denial. This was a world where cleanliness was not indulgence. It was penance. Not about feeling good. About not feeling at all. Let's begin with the basics. Monasteries, particularly in Western Europe between the 6th and 12th centuries, were designed for lives of simplicity, repetition, and spiritual focus. Monks were meant to deny the pleasures of the body, including warmth, softness, and in many cases, comfort itself. This included bathing. Not because monks didn't value hygiene, though it wasn't the highest priority, but because pleasure from cleanliness was viewed with suspicion. Cleanliness for the soul was paramount. Cleanliness of the body, however, was a slippery slope. If scrubbing yourself led to self-admiration, or God forbid, enjoyment, then you were one step away from vanity and sin. In theory, most monastic orders permitted bathing. The Benedictine rule, for example, allowed sick monks to bathe as needed, and others, according to necessity. But how that necessity was interpreted varied. In colder regions like northern France or England, monks might bathe only once or twice a year. Yes, once or twice a year. Public baths existed in cities, of course, and some monks had access to heated water in monastic complexes. But many chose not to use it. Warm water was indulgent. Cold water was purifying. Cold water shocked the body and humbled the spirit. Imagine waking before dawn. The floor icy beneath your bare feet. The stone basin filled with water that had chilled overnight. You dipped your fingers in. Splashed your face. Rubbed your hands. You didn't scrub, or lather, or massage. You purified with brief contact, like washing away not dirt, but temptation. For those in stricter orders, bathing was almost discouraged. The Carthusians, for example, practiced extreme isolation and denial. Each monk had his own cell, and might go months without touching warm water. Physical discomfort was the point. To feel the body suffer was to remember the suffering of Christ. And yet, ironically, monasteries often had some of the best sanitation technology of the time. Cloisters were built with running water channels, drainage systems, lavatoriums, or communal wash areas, where monks could rinse hands before meals or prayer. They had access to what most peasants lacked. But again, it wasn't about access. It was about restraint. Soap was made, usually from animal fat and wood ash. Sometimes monks used it, sometimes not. Hair was kept short or shaved entirely to reduce lice. Robes were coarse and seldom washed. Undercloths, if worn, might be rinsed occasionally. But heavy laundry was done seasonally, if at all. So how did monks stay clean? The truth is, they didn't, not by our modern standards. But they also didn't care. Cleanliness was redefined. The stench of a monastic dormitory might be unpleasant, but it was holy stench. Humble. Unworldly. There were, of course, exceptions. In warmer regions, like southern Italy or Spain, monks bathed more often. Mediterranean culture held on to Roman bathing traditions longer. And some monasteries had entire bathing complexes with hot air and steam. But even then, use was limited. Regulated. It was never about feeling good. Always about submission. Punishment, too, could be tied to water. A monk who disobeyed might be denied even minimal washing, or made to wash in icy conditions as penance, or forced to clean communal areas with rough hands and no reward. Cleanliness became discipline. It wasn't about health. It was about humility. And yet, monks played a key role in preserving hygiene knowledge. They copied ancient texts, stored herbal remedies, recorded cures and recipes. They understood, at least in theory, the connection between cleanliness and health. But health was secondary to obedience. And that obedience often required suffering. So while the average medieval monk may not have bathed regularly, he likely rinsed his hands before meals, washed his feet on occasion, shaved his tonsure in silence, and offered every action as a kind of worship, even if that meant never really scrubbing behind the ears. In the end, the monastic approach to cleanliness offers us a strange lesson. That cleanliness, like everything else, is shaped by belief, by purpose, by what we're trying to achieve, and sometimes, by what we're trying to deny. So as you rest tonight, imagine the cold basin, the silent corridor, the distant bell calling monks to prayer, and a life so far removed from modern showers and soaps, it might as well be another planet. But even there, even in the austerity of cold stone walls, people still tried to be clean. In their own strange, devout, and deeply uncomfortable way. Soap, that magical slippery bar we take for granted today, has a much more complicated history than you might imagine. In ancient times, the idea of soap existed, but it was far from the luxurious, fragrant, and effective cleansing agent we know. Instead, it was a crude, often smelly concoction that barely worked, and sometimes did more harm than good. Let's step back thousands of years to ancient Babylon, around 2800 BCE, where some of the first known soap-like substances were created. Babylonians mixed animal fats with wood ash and water to create a greasy paste. This mixture was used primarily for cleaning wool and cotton in textile production rather than for washing skin. Using soap on the body wasn't common, because the concept of personal hygiene was very different. Fast forward to ancient Egypt. The Egyptians made soaps from animal and vegetable oils mixed with alkaline salts. They used these mixtures to treat skin diseases and clean themselves. But soap wasn't yet a daily bath ritual. Instead, it was more medicinal or cosmetic. The Romans inherited and improved upon these practices. Roman soap was made similarly, and they were fond of public baths, where people used oils and scrapers called strigils to clean their bodies, often with soap-like substances on hand. But even then, soap was more for scrubbing oils and dirt off than the fragrant, bubbly bars we know now. So why was ancient soap so bad? First, the ingredients were crude. Animal fats often had unpleasant odors that the simple lime mixtures couldn't fully mask. The soap's alkalinity was unpredictable because wood ash wasn't a pure chemical. It varied depending on the wood and how it was burned. This meant soap could be too harsh, causing skin irritation or even chemical burns, or too weak to clean effectively. Second, the knowledge of chemistry was limited. Soap making was more an art passed down informally, often by trial and error. No one knew exactly why it worked or how to control the process consistently. Third, cultural attitudes towards soap and cleanliness varied. In many cultures, using too much soap was suspicious because it removed the natural oils that were thought to protect the skin and the spirit. Soap was sometimes seen as harsh or unnatural. Finally, soap was expensive. It took resources and time to produce. Most common people didn't have access to it, or used other cleaning agents like sand, ash, or simply water. Even when soap was used, it wasn't always pleasant. The smell was often strong and sour, the texture gritty, and the residue could leave skin feeling dry and cracked. In medieval Europe, soap production became more organized in places like Italy and Spain, where the Mediterranean climate allowed cultivation of olive oil, a key ingredient for softer soap. Castile soap, made from olive oil, became famous. But even this soap was a far cry from modern versions, still harsh, still expensive, and still primarily for the wealthy. Poor people used alternatives. Ash and clay were rubbed onto the skin, sand scrubbed away dirt, and water splashed roughly on the face and hands. The idea of a daily bath with soap was a luxury for most. So when you think about soap today, with its smooth bars, delightful scents, and foamy bubbles, remember the long, messy, and often smelly journey it took to get there. For centuries, people struggled with crude, ineffective, and sometimes harmful cleaning agents that only barely scrubbed away the dirt, both physical and spiritual. Soap was not just a tool for hygiene. It was also wrapped in social status, superstition, and mystery. And this slow, complicated history shows us how deeply our modern cleanliness rituals are shaped by centuries of trial, error, and cultural beliefs. Teeth cleaning in ancient times was a peculiar affair that would likely make anyone raised with modern toothpaste and electric toothbrushes wince in horror. Though the goal was similar, removing food particles, plaque, and bad breath, the methods, materials, and cultural attitudes surrounding dental hygiene were worlds apart from what we expect today. Ancient people did care about their teeth and breath, certainly enough to develop rituals and remedies, but these were often crude, ineffective, and sometimes downright revolting. Their struggles to maintain oral cleanliness reveal a fascinating glimpse into how hygiene was intertwined with available resources, cultural beliefs, and a general lack of scientific understanding. The earliest known dental hygiene tool is probably the chewing stick, a simple twig from certain aromatic trees. This was a practical, readily available option that many ancient civilizations adopted. People would chew on one end of the twig until it became soft and frayed, creating a makeshift brush which could be rubbed against the teeth and gums. Chewing sticks came in various types, depending on the region. For example, the Babylonians used twigs from trees like Salvadora persica, which has natural antibacterial properties, while ancient Egyptians used licorice root or other fragrant plants. In India, the neem tree twigs were popular for their reputed medicinal and antiseptic qualities. Though these twigs provided a rudimentary mechanical cleaning, they were far from perfect. The bristles were coarse and didn't effectively reach all the nooks and crannies where food and plaque gathered. Alongside chewing sticks, early toothpaste or tooth powders began to emerge, though these mixtures would shock anyone accustomed to the smooth, minty gels sold today. The ancient Egyptians, known for their elaborate beauty rituals, crafted tooth powders from crushed eggshells, pumice stone, ashes, and powdered ox hooves. They often added fragrant herbs, and spices to mask unpleasant odors and leave a fresh taste. Despite the use of aromatic ingredients, many of these mixtures were abrasive and could damage tooth enamel rather than protect it. The Romans took dental care a step further, mixing crushed bones, oyster shells, and sometimes charcoal into their cleaning powders. One particularly surprising and unpleasant ingredient was urine. Yes, ancient Romans believed that the ammonia in urine helped whiten teeth and kill bacteria. This belief was so widespread that urine was collected and even imported from other regions for this purpose. While the ammonia does have some cleansing properties, the idea of rinsing or brushing teeth with urine is enough to make modern mouths cringe. In China, toothpaste recipes sometimes included powdered ox hooves mixed with herbal elements, designed to polish teeth and freshen breath. Meanwhile, in the Indian subcontinent, people chewed neem twigs and used charcoal pastes to maintain oral hygiene. Many of these substances were effective in reducing bacterial load due to their antiseptic properties, but often came with a trade-off: abrasion. Frequent use of harsh powders or chewing sticks could erode enamel, leading to increased sensitivity and vulnerability to tooth decay. The quest for fresh breath was a social necessity even then, as it is now. Bad breath, or halitosis, was a common and embarrassing issue that ancient peoples addressed with whatever means they had. Aromatic herbs such as mint, cinnamon, and cloves were popular breath fresheners. People would chew on these herbs or carry small pouches of fragrant spices to sniff throughout the day. The ancient Greeks and Romans often chewed fennel seeds or myrtle berries to mask unpleasant odors. These practices, while not curing dental diseases, helped maintain social comfort. Despite these efforts, ancient peoples suffered widespread dental problems. Archaeological studies of ancient skulls reveal worn teeth, cavities, abscesses, and severe gum disease. Diet played a significant role in this. Many ancient diets were rich in coarse grains and sugars, especially in settled agricultural societies, which contributed to tooth decay. Without the ability to effectively remove plaque, bacteria flourished, leading to infections that could become life-threatening. When toothaches struck, the remedies were desperate and painful. Without dentists or anesthetics, people resorted to crude methods such as using heated metal rods to cauterize the nerve, or extracting teeth with simple pliers or other tools. Herbal poultices were applied to soothe pain, sometimes containing ingredients like cloves for their numbing effect. These treatments were often temporary solutions, as the underlying dental issues persisted. Interestingly, some cultures linked dental hygiene with spiritual or magical beliefs. Clean teeth were associated with purity, while dental problems were sometimes interpreted as signs of spiritual imbalance, or even punishment from the gods. This made the act of cleaning teeth not only a physical necessity, but a ritualistic practice with religious overtones. So, despite all the challenges, it's clear that ancient people did care deeply about their teeth and breath. They created tools and concoctions, however crude, to try to maintain oral cleanliness. Their struggle with dental hygiene is a vivid reminder of how far human knowledge and technology have advanced, turning what was once a painful and smelly chore into a simple, refreshing daily habit. The next time you brush your teeth and savor that mini freshness, take a moment to appreciate the generations who battled plaque with twigs, ashes, crushed bones, and even urine, all in the pursuit of a cleaner mouth. It was a messy, smelly, and difficult journey, but it laid the groundwork for the dental care we enjoy today. Hair care in ancient times was a messy, smelly, and sometimes downright desperate affair. Unlike the modern world where shampoo, conditioner, and countless styling products abound, ancient peoples had to make do with whatever they could find, often natural ingredients, that had mixed results. Clean hair wasn't always a priority, especially compared to more urgent survival concerns, but people did have some rituals and remedies to try and keep their manes manageable and somewhat clean. One of the biggest challenges was lice. Lice infestations were common across the ancient world, with no chemical treatments or fine-toothed metal combs as we have today. Instead, people resorted to a variety of methods, some more effective than others, to get rid of these persistent parasites. First, let's talk about hair washing. Water sources weren't always clean, so washing hair frequently could sometimes cause more problems than it solved. Many ancient cultures used infusions of herbs, animal fats, and natural soaps to cleanse hair. For example, the ancient Egyptians were known for their elaborate grooming routines. They used mixtures of water and animal fats, sometimes scented with fragrant oils, to wash their hair. The oils helped protect hair from drying out, but could leave a greasy residue that attracted dirt. In Greece and Rome, people often used a mix of ashes and water as a rudimentary shampoo. The alkaline nature of ash helped break down grease and grime. However, this could also be harsh on the scalp and hair, sometimes causing irritation or damage. The Romans also favored perfumed oils, which they rubbed into their hair and scalp for scent and conditioning. These oils often masked underlying odors, but didn't necessarily clean the hair deeply. In some Asian cultures, people used rice water or herbal infusions to wash hair. The starches in rice water were thought to strengthen hair and add shine. While these treatments could be beneficial, they still didn't tackle issues like lice effectively. Speaking of lice, ancient remedies were many and often desperate. People used fine combs made from bone or wood to manually remove lice and nits. These combs required patience and skill, as lice cling tightly to hair shafts. Some cultures tried smothering lice with oils like olive or sesame oil, hoping to suffocate them. Others resorted to applying mixtures of vinegar, sulfur, or even mercury compounds, which could be toxic but were used for their supposed medicinal effects. The Greek physician Hippocrates recommended a mixture of pitch and resin to treat lice infestations, while in medieval Europe, people tried concoctions involving herbs like rosemary, wormwood, or pennyroyal to repel or kill lice. None of these methods were completely reliable, and lice remained a persistent nuisance throughout history. Beyond lice, ancient hair care involved styling that reflected social status, culture, and sometimes even superstition. Hairstyles could be elaborate and required significant maintenance, using oils, beeswax, or even animal fat. For example, Roman women often used scented oils and powders to style their hair into intricate shapes, while Egyptian priests shaved their heads to maintain ritual purity. Washing hair less frequently was common due to limited water and the difficulties in drying hair afterward. This meant that grease and dirt accumulated, which might seem unpleasant to us, but was often accepted or even considered normal. Sometimes, accumulated oils helped protect hair and scalp from the elements. Ultimately, hair hygiene was a constant balancing act. Ancient peoples fought to keep hair clean and lice-free, but with limited tools and knowledge, the results were often imperfect. Their struggles remind us that even something as simple as clean hair has a long, difficult history behind it. Bathing, the simple act of washing one's body, has a surprisingly complicated history, especially in ancient times when clean water was precious and hygiene was far from a daily priority. Unlike the modern ritual of a hot shower or bath that most of us enjoy daily, ancient bathing was often infrequent, socially and religiously charged, and sometimes more about ritual purification than actual cleanliness. This meant that many people went long stretches without proper washing, relying instead on whatever quick or makeshift methods they could manage. In many ancient cultures, bathing was linked to religious purity. For example, the ancient Hebrews had strict laws about ritual washing to cleanse impurity, which often meant bathing was more symbolic than practical. Similarly, Hindu traditions included ritual baths and sacred rivers, but these were often less about soap and scrubbing and more about spiritual cleansing. These rituals sometimes meant people avoided washing with soap or harsh scrubbing for fear of losing spiritual benefits or disturbing the natural oils on their skin. Access to water was another huge limiting factor. Fresh water was often scarce or needed for drinking and cooking, so using it for bathing was a luxury many couldn't afford daily. In cities, public baths emerged as social hubs, but these were communal and often crowded. The famous Roman baths, for example, were complex facilities where people gathered to bathe, socialize, and even conduct business. However, the water was often not changed frequently, meaning it could become quite dirty. For the average person, bathing might mean a quick splash of water, rubbing down with sand or ash to scrub off grime, or even rolling in mud or dust to absorb sweat and oils. Ash was a surprisingly common abrasive, acting like a natural soap in the absence of detergents. Ancient Germanic tribes were known to rub their bodies with sand or clay, then brush it off, effectively exfoliating but not rinsing thoroughly. Soap itself had a long and complicated history. Early soaps were made from animal fats and wood ashes, essentially a crude form of lye soap. While the Babylonians had soap-like substances as early as 2800 BCE, these were mostly used for cleaning textiles, and not personal hygiene. The widespread use of soap for bathing didn't take hold until much later, with medieval Europe only gradually adopting it. Even when soap was available, people often avoided washing too frequently because of the belief that too much water or soap could harm the skin's natural oils, or upset the body's balance. This was especially true in colder climates, where bathing was less practical. In some cultures, people preferred dry cleaning methods, rubbing their bodies with cloth or powders rather than water. Bathing also varied widely depending on social class. Wealthier individuals had access to more elaborate baths, scented oils, and attendants to help them clean and groom. The poor, on the other hand, often bathed rarely, if at all, due to lack of access to clean water and facilities. This contributed to the overall perception that cleanliness was a luxury, not a daily necessity. The unpleasant consequences of infrequent bathing included widespread body odor, skin diseases, and infestations of parasites such as lice and fleas. People coped with these realities as best they could, sometimes using perfumes and scented oils to mask odors, or herbal poultices to soothe irritated skin. So, while we today may take a daily shower or bath for granted, ancient peoples faced a world where bathing was a complex, often rare, and smelly affair. Their approaches to cleanliness remind us how essential water and hygiene products are, and how much progress has been made since those muddy, dusty days of ancient times. When it comes to ancient hygiene, toilets and waste disposal were among the messiest and most unpleasant aspects. Unlike the modern flush toilets and sewage systems that whisk away waste invisibly and efficiently, ancient people had to cope with primitive, smelly, and often unhygienic methods of managing bodily waste. This not only impacted cleanliness, but also public health, making waste disposal a critical yet revolting part of daily life. In many ancient societies, the idea of privacy as we know it today did not exist. People often used communal latrines, which were open pits or benches with holes carved into stone or wood, positioned side by side without partitions. For example, ancient Rome was famous for its public latrines, where people gathered to relieve themselves and, surprisingly to modern sensibilities, socialize. These facilities were flushed by a continuous stream of water running underneath, but without proper sanitation knowledge, they still became breeding grounds for disease. In more rural or less developed areas, people often relied on simple pits, or just went outdoors, sometimes near their homes. Waste was frequently dumped into streets or nearby rivers, leading to polluted water supplies and foul smells. Ancient cities had to deal with overflowing waste in their narrow streets, attracting flies, rats, and other pests that spread illnesses. Cleaning after defecation was another challenging aspect of ancient hygiene. The modern toilet paper roll was non-existent, and instead, people used a variety of materials, depending on availability, culture, and class. The ancient Romans famously used a sponge on a stick, called a tersorium, which was rinsed in a bucket of water or a gutter after use. While this might seem unsanitary to us, it was a common practice and likely better than many alternatives. Other cultures used natural materials like leaves, moss, stones, or even water. In parts of Asia, washing with water was common, and continues in many places today. However, these methods also came with their own risks of infection, if not done carefully. Waste disposal was often a communal problem. In ancient Mesopotamia, laws regulated where waste could be dumped to prevent contamination of drinking water. Despite such regulations, enforcement was difficult, and waste often accumulated in streets or waterways. This contributed to outbreaks of diseases such as dysentery, cholera, and typhoid, common killers in ancient times. In some places, human waste was collected and used as fertilizer in agriculture. While this practice was practical and sustainable, it required careful handling to avoid contaminating food supplies. The risks of parasitic infections and bacterial diseases remained high. Interestingly, some ancient civilizations developed surprisingly advanced sanitation infrastructure. The Indus Valley Civilization, around 2500 BCE, had complex drainage systems and private toilets connected to sewers, indicating a keen understanding of waste management. However, such innovations were rare exceptions rather than the rule. The general lack of effective waste disposal and sanitation meant that ancient people often lived surrounded by their own filth, making hygiene difficult to maintain. This environment fostered the spread of disease, which could decimate populations and influence the course of history. In summary, ancient toilet habits and waste disposal practices were far from clean or pleasant. Primitive facilities, poor waste management, and limited personal hygiene created a world where stink and sickness were constants. It's a stark reminder of how vital modern sanitation systems are to health and comfort, luxuries that ancient people could only dream of. In a world where regular bathing and laundry were rare luxuries, ancient people had to contend with the overwhelming reality of body odors and unpleasant smells, not just their own but those of their surroundings. This meant that smell played a surprisingly important role in ancient hygiene practices, social interactions, and even medicine. Since true cleanliness was often impossible, masking bad odors became a crucial part of everyday life. Body odor, caused by sweat and bacterial growth on the skin, was a constant challenge, especially in warm climates where sweating was frequent and clothes were changed infrequently. Ancient people recognized this and used a variety of methods to cover or reduce these smells, ranging from simple herbal infusions to elaborate perfumes. Perfumes and scented oils were highly valued commodities in many ancient cultures. The Egyptians, in particular, were renowned for their expertise in perfume making, using fragrant resins, flowers, and spices. They applied oils not only to mask odors, but also as part of religious rituals and social status displays. Perfumed oils helped hide body odors, but also often made hair and skin greasy, which paradoxically could attract dirt. In ancient Mesopotamia, perfumes were equally prized. Archaeological findings reveal that they used ingredients such as myrrh, frankincense, and cedar wood to create complex scents. These scents were not just personal fragrances, but also used in temples and royal courts to create an aura of sanctity and power. Greece and Rome also had a strong perfume culture. Wealthy Romans were known to use heavy perfumes, often combining oils with floral and herbal essences. Roman baths included scented oils and scrubs to soften skin and add fragrance. Perfumes were often imported from distant lands, making them expensive and exclusive to the upper classes. Beyond perfuming the body, ancient people also tried to deodorize their clothes. Since laundry was infrequent and clothes often reused without washing, scented sachets, herbal bags, or fumigation with smoke and incense were common. This practice helped disguise the lingering smells of sweat, dirt, and smoke. Ancient texts sometimes mention herbal baths, or washes designed to reduce body odor, or repel pests like lice and fleas. Ingredients such as rosemary, lavender, mint, and sage were commonly used in such preparations, though their effectiveness was limited by modern standards. Interestingly, smell was also connected to health and spirituality. In many cultures, bad odors were thought to be signs of disease or spiritual impurity. Conversely, pleasant smells were believed to have protective or purifying powers. This belief influenced medical treatments and hygiene rituals alike. For the average person, the constant struggle against unpleasant smells was a fact of life. With infrequent bathing, dirty clothes, and limited access to perfumes, body odor was unavoidable. Perfumes and scented oils, while helpful, were often reserved for the wealthy. leaving most people to rely on less effective methods like rubbing herbs on the skin or burning incense indoors. The overall result was a world filled with a mix of natural and artificial odors, sweat, smoke, cooking fires, animal smells, and the strong sense of herbs and perfumes blended into a complex, often overwhelming atmosphere. Ancient people adapted to this reality, and smell became a cultural factor as much as a hygiene issue. In summary, while ancient people struggled with cleanliness in body and environment, they compensated by mastering the art of scent, using perfumes, oils, and herbs to mask odors, and maintain social decorum. This reliance on smell rather than cleanliness highlights just how different ancient hygiene was from modern standards, reminding us that what we consider essential today was once a luxury or an impossible dream. Hair care in ancient times was another challenging aspect of personal hygiene. While today we have shampoos, conditioners, and countless hair care products, ancient people had to rely on natural ingredients and sometimes rudimentary techniques to keep their hair and scalps clean, or at least tolerable. Given the lack of regular bathing and the ever-present dirt, sweat, and lice, maintaining hair hygiene was a constant, messy struggle. Ancient hairstyles varied widely depending on culture, status, and personal preference. Egyptians favored elaborate wigs and braids, Greeks preferred loose curls, and Romans had their own complex coiffures. However, no matter the style, the underlying problem remained the same: dirt and lice infestation were persistent enemies. Lice, especially head lice, were a universal plague in the ancient world. These tiny parasites thrived in the unwashed, often sweaty hair of people who rarely removed their head coverings or cleaned their scalps. Lice could cause intense itching, skin irritation, and secondary infections, making them a serious annoyance and health hazard. To combat lice and clean their hair, ancient people used a variety of methods. Combs made from bone, wood, or metal were used to remove lice and nits, often with painstaking effort. Sometimes fine-toothed combs were passed down through generations as treasured tools. In addition to physical removal, people applied natural insecticides and treatments. Oils infused with herbs like rosemary, lavender, and pennyroyal were used both to condition hair and repel lice. Some cultures burnt sulfur or used smoke to fumigate homes and bedding, attempting to reduce infestations. Washing hair was a rare event compared to modern standards. When possible, people used water mixed with plant extracts, clay, or ashes as crude shampoos. These substances helped remove grease and dirt but were often harsh and drying. Hair was frequently oily or crusted with grime between washings. The use of wigs and hairpieces in some cultures, such as ancient Egypt, helped protect natural hair from the daily dirt and lice. Wigs were cleaned separately, sometimes by specialists, and could be removed to keep the scalp less exposed to the elements. Scalp hygiene was also linked to social status and religious practice. In some cultures, priests or nobles were expected to keep their hair clean and well-groomed as a sign of purity and power. Conversely, the poor and slaves often had little access to hair care, resulting in matted, dirty hair and severe infestations. Overall, hair and scalp hygiene in ancient times was a constant battle against dirt, sweat, and parasites. The limited means available meant that even those with the best efforts often lived with less than clean hair. This reality contributed to the overall, badly cleaned, state of ancient people, affecting comfort, health, and social standing. Living in a world without modern hygiene conveniences came with a heavy price. The poorly cleaned bodies, clothes, and environments of ancient peoples weren't just unpleasant, they had profound and lasting effects on health, society, and history. Understanding these consequences sheds light on how fundamental cleanliness is to human well-being, and how far we have come. The most immediate and devastating impact of bad ancient hygiene was the rampant spread of infectious diseases. Without effective methods to remove dirt, kill germs, or dispose of waste safely, ancient populations were vulnerable to epidemics of cholera, typhoid, dysentery, plague, and countless parasitic infections. These illnesses caused high mortality rates, especially among children, the elderly, and the already weakened. Poor sanitation was a direct contributor to many of these outbreaks. Rivers and wells contaminated with human waste became breeding grounds for bacteria and viruses. Flies and rats, attracted by garbage and sewage, carried diseases from place to place. In crowded cities and military camps, diseases could spread rapidly, decimating populations and even altering the outcomes of wars and political power struggles. Skin infections and infestations by lice, fleas, and mites were widespread. These conditions caused constant discomfort, secondary infections, and sometimes serious complications. The lack of effective treatments meant that many suffered lifelong consequences from what we would now consider minor hygiene failures. Socially, the stigma of dirt and smell often affected individuals standing in their communities. Those who could afford better hygiene, such as the wealthy elite, used cleanliness and perfumes to distinguish themselves. Meanwhile, the poor were trapped in cycles of dirt, disease, and social exclusion, unable to access the luxuries of cleanliness. Religious and cultural beliefs about purity and filth shaped hygiene practices, but also sometimes hindered effective cleaning. Rituals could emphasize symbolic purity over physical cleanliness, and taboos might prevent certain groups from accessing clean water or washing facilities. These dynamics complicated efforts to improve hygiene or sanitation in ancient societies. On a broader scale, the lack of hygiene infrastructure limited urban development and quality of life. Ancient cities often suffered from overcrowding, pollution, and poor living conditions that made everyday life difficult and dangerous. The slow evolution of sewage systems and public baths represented attempts to mitigate these problems, but progress was uneven and slow. Despite these challenges, ancient people adapted as best they could. They developed cultural norms around hygiene, used natural remedies, and created rudimentary sanitation systems, when possible. These early efforts laid the groundwork for later advances in cleanliness and public health, though many of the fundamental issues remained for centuries. In the end, the ancient struggle with cleanliness was not just about appearance or comfort, it was a battle for survival. The limitations of their hygiene practices shaped their lives in profound ways, reminding us that the modern luxuries of running water, soap, and sanitation are hard-won achievements. They represent a triumph of knowledge, technology, and public health that continues to protect and improve human life today. Imagine living in a world where the very idea of daily washing, fresh clothes, or even clean water is a luxury few can afford. Ancient people existed in such a world, where survival took precedence over scrubbing and cleanliness was a rare, often symbolic, privilege rather than a daily practice. Dirt and sweat were constants, filth was normal, and the concept of hygiene, as we understand it today, was often alien. This summary explores the messy, often unpleasant realities of how people cleaned themselves, or failed to, in ancient times, revealing a world where cleanliness was complicated, smelly, and a struggle against nature itself. At the heart of ancient hygiene was the basic fact that most people did not prioritize cleanliness the way we do. Dirt and grime were part of life, especially for the lower classes, who spent their days working outdoors, tending animals, or in cramped urban environments, where waste disposal was minimal. Unlike modern society, where personal hygiene is linked to health and social acceptance, ancient people's priorities often focused on basic survival, finding food, shelter, and avoiding immediate dangers, rather than cleanliness. In many cultures, there was a different mindset about what counted as clean, and a distinction between physical filth and ritual purity. For example, some religions emphasize symbolic cleanliness for spiritual reasons, while physical dirt might be tolerated or even ignored. This disconnect meant that the struggle for cleanliness was often sporadic, incomplete, and dictated by custom rather than necessity. Bathing practices varied widely but were generally infrequent, uncomfortable, and sometimes dangerous. Access to clean water was a major limiting factor. In urban centers, water sources could be polluted, forcing people to rely on rivers, wells, or communal baths that were themselves often contaminated. Bathing was rarely daily, sometimes monthly or even less frequent, and often involve quick rinses or washes rather than thorough scrubbing. The ancient Romans famously built public baths as centers for socializing and relaxation, but even then, many people could not afford regular visits or found them unhygienic due to overcrowding and stagnant water. In other regions, bathing was tied to ritual cleansing, done in cold or tepid water without soap, offering minimal removal of dirt. Soap as we know it today was generally unknown or rudimentary. Early soap-like substances were made from animal fats and ashes, or plant-based saponins, but these were not widely used or effective by modern standards. Instead, people relied on alternative cleaning agents like oils, sand, and herbal concoctions. Oils, particularly in Egypt and Rome, were applied to the skin and then scraped off with a tool called a strigil, which helped remove dirt but left the skin oily and sometimes attracted more grime. Sand or fine dirt was rubbed into the skin to exfoliate but often just spread dirt around. The use of herbs and perfumes helped mask odors, but did little to truly clean the body. Clothing hygiene presented a separate challenge. Ancient clothes were made from natural fibers such as linen, wool, or animal hides, which absorbed sweat and odors and were worn repeatedly. Washing clothes was laborious and rare. People washed clothes by soaking and scrubbing them in water mixed with ashes, clay, or fermented urine, particularly in Roman Fulonic public laundry centers, where workers stomped clothes in vats of urine to remove grease and stains. Despite these efforts, clothes often remained stained and smelly. Drying was dependent on weather and space, meaning clothes could stay damp for days, encouraging mildew and more odors. Clean clothes were markers of wealth, while the poor often wore dirty, patched garments until they fell apart. Hair and scalp care was yet another area fraught with difficulties. Without regular washing or effective shampoos, hair became greasy, matted, and infested with lice. Combating lice was a constant battle, involving physical removal with combs, and applying natural insect repellent herbs like rosemary, lavender, and pennyroyal. Some cultures use smoke or sulfur fumes to fumigate homes and bedding. Wigs and hairpieces, especially in Egypt, provided some relief by protecting natural hair from dirt and lice, but these were luxuries. The poor had little access to hair care, leading to discomfort and social stigma. Hair hygiene also had religious and social significance, with priests or elites expected to maintain better grooming. Body odor was a pervasive problem. Sweat mixed with dirt and the lack of washing created strong smells. Since true cleanliness was rare, ancient people relied heavily on perfumes, scented oils, and incense to mask odors. The Egyptians were skilled perfumers, using fragrant resins, flowers, and spices. Mesopotamians, Greeks, and Romans also prized perfumes, often using expensive imported ingredients. Perfumes served social and religious purposes, but often left the skin greasy or attracted dirt, creating a complicated trade-off. Clothes, rarely washed, were similarly scented with herbal sachets, or fumigated with incense to hide smells. Sanitation was generally poor, with waste disposal methods ranging from simple pit latrines to open cesspits, and even public dumping. Cities often lacked proper sewage systems, causing contamination of water sources, and facilitating the spread of disease. Flies, rats, and other vermin thrived in these conditions, carrying infections. The combination of poor hygiene, contaminated water, and dense populations made epidemics common. Cholera, typhoid, plague, and parasitic diseases claimed millions of lives. Skin infections and infestations caused chronic suffering. The social consequences of dirt and smell reinforced inequality, with the wealthy using hygiene and perfume to mark status while the poor remained trapped in filth. Despite all these challenges, ancient people adapted through rituals, cultural practices, and sometimes rudimentary infrastructure. Public baths, early sewage channels, herbal remedies, and social norms around cleanliness evolved slowly over centuries. Still, for most, the battle against dirt was never truly won. The result was a world where cleanliness was a luxury, where people lived with smells and grime unimaginable to us today, and where hygiene struggles shaped daily life, health, and society profoundly. This history of badly cleaned humanity reminds us of the incredible progress modern society has made with clean water, sanitation, and hygiene. It also underscores that cleanliness is not just about comfort or appearance but is central to survival and well-being. Understanding the ancient reality enriches our appreciation for the basic human need for cleanliness and the technologies and social systems that make it possible today.